What we're going to do now is have a brief summary of McKinsey's recent research on the business value of design. The reason that we undertook this research at all was that over the last 5 years, we've seen an explosion in the number of questions from CEOs and senior business leaders on design. And the exciting thing here is that the aspirations are almost universally high. These people are asking, what does it take for us to make the next iPhone, the next Google homepage, the next Disneyland experience of our respective industries? What we're also hearing is it's a remarkably difficult thing to do. And people aren't sure if the actions that they are taking, those extra dollars that they're spending on design, on designers, on user research, are actually leading to better products and services for their customers. So that was the context, and here's what we did about it. Over a 5-year period, we followed the fates and fortunes of 300 publicly listed companies. And we were interested in 2 things about these companies. We were interested in their financial performance. How did they do in terms of revenue, profit, shareholder return? But we were also interested in the design actions that they took. And an example of a design action could be putting someone in your executive board who has a responsibility for design. Or another example could be changing your management incentives to tie to user-centric metrics in addition to financial metrics, to name just 2. And then the magic of the research was for those companies to take all of the design actions that they had taken over a 5-year period and consolidate that into a single number, a single design performance number, a McKinsey Design Index score. The question, of course, is there any correlation between being good at design and improved financial performance? Spoiler alert, yes, there is, otherwise we wouldn't be giving this talk at all, but let's have a look at the data anyway. So what we have here are remarkable results. What this is showing us is that for those organizations in the top quartile of design performers, they are growing their revenues at twice the rate of their industry peers. And it's a similar story on shareholder return. The top design performers are growing shareholder returns 70% faster than their industry peers. Those numbers are so exciting, I'm going to show them to you, again, pretty much identical numbers, but in a slightly different graph, just to really bring this point home. These are numbers which would make any CEO or CFO pay attention. I think what this is really is a moment to recognize that design has arrived in the C-suite. It has been elevated to being a strategic priority. Because if at the end of a 5-year period, you're able to have 32 percentage points higher revenue, 56 percentage points higher shareholder return, that has to be a strategic priority for any company. It's worth mentioning that when we did this research, we had a broad definition of design. We didn't want this just to be a case of being about color, material, and finish. And the McKinsey definition of design is understanding your user's needs and then creating a solution to meet those needs. There's no part of that definition that mentions whether it's physical design, service design. Design is design. Design is coming up with a solution to meet those needs. And to make that point clear, when we did the research, we looked at 3 very different industries. So you've got consumer packaged goods, which has traditionally been about physical design. You've got medical technology, which is often a combination of physical, digital, and service. And then you've got retail banking, traditionally service and increasingly digital every year that passes. And what you're seeing here is that old tenet from the 1970s that good business is good design and vice versa, absolutely true across those industries. So this is not just about physical design. A final insight to share from the raw data itself. Whilst this isn't quite a case of winner takes all, it is a case of disproportionate rewards. You look at the top quartile, they're the only ones who stand out from the crowd and get investors' attention for shareholder return. They're the ones who get the users to pay attention and get the revenue benefits associated with being a top quartile performer. And that kind of makes sense from a user perspective. No one cares whether you go from being the 32nd to the 30 best product or service in the market. This is all about being in the top 3. And the reason that matters for many of you in the room is if you're the leader of an organization, you need to make a bold decision. Are we really going to go all in and become a top quartile organization? Or frankly, maybe we shouldn't be doing it at all. Now, great to have this data to finally prove that good design is good business. What's more exciting, though, from the research is because of the approach that was taken, we can now point out the individual design actions that leaders take that have best correlation with improved business performance. And we're going to talk through each of them in turn, just to give you a flavor. Goodness me, animation, look at the high production values on that. That is exciting. We are interested in all the actions that were taken. There were hundreds of design actions that were taken. But what was clear from the data is that there were 4 themes, 4 clusters of design actions that leaders can take that showed best correlation with improved financial performance. The first of these was that in top-performing organizations, design was more than a feeling. And what we mean by that is they treated design with the same level of rigor that you might treat revenue or cost. If you walk into one of their boardrooms, the COO will hold up a dashboard and say, here's how we're doing in terms of cost and quality. Then the head of sales will stand up and say, here's how we're doing in terms of volumes in our key regions. And then the head of design will stand up like a peer to those other people who have spoken before them, and their dashboard will say, here's how we're doing in terms of our design metrics across our brands and portfolios. Critical that they bring that data to it. And we're not saying that there isn't an art and a craft to design, but what is clear from the data is there has to be an element of science to the management of design. The second theme is around design being more than a department. Many of the companies that were part of the research had an isolated design department that had built, unfortunately, an antagonistic relationship with some of the other functions in the organization. Time and time again, that showed correlation to poor financial performance. The companies who were most successful in this space were the ones who counterintuitively had de-emphasized the importance of the design department, but elevated the importance of designers. And they took those designers, they placed them into cross-functional teams, and they made sure that those teams, regardless of whether it was finance, R&D, marketing, everyone had aligned incentives, of course on cost, quality, and time, but also on design and user-centric metrics. What did that do? Well, it suddenly means that design is everyone's responsibility, not just a siloed function, and you see an improved performance financially. We're halfway there, so exciting. I'm going to add some danger to this by standing by the edge, just to add some extra G's to the feeling in the room. Design being more than a phase. There are many companies out there for whom design is still a discrete phase. You lock your design, and then you hurtle it towards launch, come success or failure. That's a pretty high-risk strategy. The companies who perform best are the ones who iterate early and often before they've invested in tooling, software, other things down the line, and they continue to launch and iterate even post-launch. To go from good to great, not only do companies iterate with their users, but they use a combination of qualitative and quantitative techniques. And we saw direct correlation between using additional techniques to ethnographic techniques, such as conjoint analysis, warranty analysis, click-through and payment data, to improve results in terms of products and services. 1 to go. The final one is around design being more than a product. Many companies, in fact entire industries, have been very successful at product design or service design or digital design. They've always been about physical product, or they've always been about software. What's interesting about that is the very success that they've had in the past can actually become an inhibitor to success in the future. They always assume that their starting point for their next product or service, they need to look backwards. The companies that performed best from this research were the ones who, each time they had a new product to start, started with a customer journey. They looked at what the pain points were, they worked out what combination of physical service and digital design would best meet those needs, and worked out where they were going to do it themselves versus in partnership. And what the hallmark of those companies were is that they weren't hamstrung by the past. They were willing to say, yes, that's where we've come from, but 2019 is all about converging design and coming up with a seamless experience across different design functions. So those are the themes. For many of you in the room, myself included, those should feel like themes that we've been talking about for many years. And whilst they may feel like common sense, what is absolutely clear is they are not yet common practice. 3 examples of that. 2/3 of the companies that we looked at, 200 of them, aren't sharing prototypes with users. They're purely using them internally for R&D and quality validation processes. 150 of the companies that we looked at weren't involving users prior to launching product development. Product development was essentially launched by an R&D spec or a marketing spec. Users were involved much later, by which time costs had already been sunk in tooling, and often it was too late to actually make directional changes. Again, that's a pretty high-risk strategy for 2019. And finally, and this is the biggest number on the page, 95% of the organizations we spoke to felt that they were still making decisions essentially on gut when it came down to important design decisions. They weren't getting themselves up to that bar of analytical leadership and talking about design and design metrics with the same rigor as revenue and cost. So that's where we stand. I think the arrival of the report itself is an exciting signal that design truly has now landed in the C-suite. It's a topic that we hear more and more from senior business leaders, not just from design leaders. What I think is also clear from the research is that this cannot be a case of a problem which designers solve alone or that business leaders solve alone. These four themes have to have both working together. And if we do get there, then we're going to see improved growth. We're going to have companies standing out from the competition. And perhaps most importantly of all, we're just going to have better products and services out there for our customers. Thank you very much.
And thanks very much for that. Come join me on this panel because we're about to bring on some fantastic voices to add to exactly what you said. Take a seat right next to me. We're going to bring Jeanne Liedtka, professor at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and Jason Wild, Senior Vice President of Strategic Innovation at Salesforce, up on stage to continue this conversation. Welcome. Now, I'm really excited to jump straight into the conversation, but I do want to flag one thing for you all. I'm going to get you to start thinking about the questions you want to put to this panel as I start getting their positions on exactly how do we derive value in business through design. So start thinking. I'm going to come to you pretty early on, ask you for about 3 questions, collate them, and then put them to the panel. So it becomes part of the discussion because this is about what you want to know. Jeanne, I'm going to start with you because you took part in the MDI. What was your takeaway?
Well, I think it was a terrific view of design as led by designers. I think I was very interested in seeing the details of how McKinsey put it together. I think as an academic, we always want to know how the research was calculated. And so I thought that a lot of the questions that asked very explicitly how much time do you spend with customers, how often do you see customers, how often do your senior people see customers, I thought they really reflected the reality of what our research says design is really about. I think a lot of the challenges on the analytical side about how we measure the value of design, I think that's a very complex set of issues, and I think if we focus too much on the revenues and profits, for me, we miss a lot of the superpower, but I think that's something we can talk about a little bit later if you want.
Well, Jason, do you agree with that? I mean, is it a system of thinking, or do the clients that you work with look at design as part of a business strategy in a different way?
Yeah, well, thank you, Maithreyi, and it's a pleasure to be here. One of my favorite places in the world, Singapore, not just because of the warm weather coming from New York City, but such a diverse place. And love the people. I think what we're seeing, and I have the pleasure of leading a global team of innovators and designers that co-create the future with some of the most strategic customers of Salesforce. And this program that I lead has been in place for about 6 years, so we've done more than 500 engagements. And what you triggered in my mind is, I think, still extremes. I think organizations and leaders who get it, who are explicitly using the word design, and ones that I think understand the importance of being focused on the customer, putting the customer in the center of everything they do, creating a culture of agility, but aren't maybe using that specific language. So for us, I think what's really interesting is what's emerging is this notion that leaders and CEOs are realizing that you can't delegate the future, that they have to participate in the process. And if they don't, it sends the wrong signal to the organization. It's lip service. You're saying it's important, but you're spending your time elsewhere. So love to hear when CEOs and leaders are rolling up their sleeves. Tim talked about 24 days out of a year. I'm not sure that we've seen many leaders do that, but It's certainly increasing in importance. And I think the second thing is, it sounds very simple, but I think a lot of organizations struggle to do it, which is really surface data around what customers are saying. And I think a couple of things that I find really interesting is times are driving a tremendous amount of change. And if you look at the customers who are your early adopters and where they're changing behavior, and you really can respond to those changing signals, it can be very, very powerful. But it's one thing to get the insight. It's more important to take action on it.
Is there an example of that?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing is, we did a lot of work with a company, Bajaj, in India, which is the darling of the financial services industry in India. It's a non-banking financial institution, which means that it didn't have a banking license. And the leader of that organization saw the opportunity to really drive a much deeper relationship than traditional kind of a banking relationship and what people would connote from working with that. So we partnered with them to really deeply understand the voice of the customer and elevate some of the specific pain points, not through surveys, but raw information that we packaged so that the leadership team really felt like they had their pulse on what was happening in the market in India. And then we started to pilot and experiment. And one of the things that we did that was really interesting is Diwali is a very important Hindu holiday in India, and part of the rituals is gift giving, wearing your best clothes, and it's usually, obviously, a day when all the banks are closed. But by understanding what people want to do and how they interact, Bajaj was there to engage in the way that they wanted to, and they ended up in one day originating more than 250,000 loans on a day when every bank was closed in India. So I think the tangibility of testing this idea for an organization that said, yeah, we know a lot, we think we understand where we need to go, but let's really listen to our customers very deeply. And I think sometimes your worst customers, at least the rational ones, they're like best friends in school, in the sense of, why are you dating that person, or that shirt is really ugly. They can be very direct and blunt, and it can be hard and difficult to listen to, but if you take action on it, it can be very, very powerful. So not only inspiration from your customers, but inspiration from nature in the sense of, I don't know if people know this, but when a whale dies, it lays still, and it takes 30 to 40 years for the whale to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And as that's happening, different predators in the ecosystem feed off of that whale. And the point is, I think many organizations don't realize that they're dying or that they're already dead, and a lot of folks in the ecosystem may be consuming them and convincing them that they're still creating value. But if you stay centered on those customers, you'll realize where you really stand.
Jeanne, are companies that are dying not realizing that they're dying? Have they imagined the innovation that they're doing? Are they all blue whales?
You know, I think to a large extent, large companies still, despite the fact that we know we live in a world of accelerating complexity and uncertainty, are structured for top-down control. And are structured mostly to design for themselves rather than to design for the people they serve. And I think that's why the disruption we've seen from factors like globalization and the lowering of access barriers that the internet's provided are really shaking things up. I mean, we've had tools like voice of the customer forever. But the reality of it is those kinds of clumsy tools just don't provide a window into the deep kind of unarticulated needs that no survey will show up when you use it. And so I think organizations, as we think to revitalize themselves, desperately need the toolkit. But I think it's not just that they need designers doing design. I think for organizations to really reform themselves, to build the kind of adaptability and flexibility that they need, we have to democratize innovation, and we have to figure out how to have everyone practice design, because that, to me, is where the real value driver comes up. When we can use design not to change just products and services, but to actually change the internal conversation in organizations, to build a set of strategic capabilities that encourage people to be engaged and aligned and to own the kind of changes in a responsive kind of way, in a quick kind of way that we need to. I think we need design for much more important reasons than just to kind of in the short term give us better products and services. I think without this kind of new toolkit, it's going to be very hard structurally for large organizations in particular to adapt to the kind of changes in the market that we're seeing.
So Ben, how would you tell folks to do that? How do you get businesses to start adopting? Especially, say, for example, businesses who may not be sitting on the kind of data sets that you need to prove that there is value in design. How would you convince them?
Well, I'll start with the opposite. I'll tell you what I've seen fail many times, which is trying to push too many frontiers at once and saying, right, I'm going to launch a design transformation. We're going to change the culture of our entire 30,000, 100,000 person organization. The problem that many of those programs have is that 2 years on, 3 years on, it's actually very difficult to work out, did that achieve impact? Did it really make a difference? And because it's not obvious to the people around them whether it is actually making a benefit, these type of programs can die away. Where we've seen far more success, particularly for organizations that have historically not been strong in design, is to say, let's take one individual product or service that really matters to our company. Let's use that as the pilot. Let's use that to show that across the 4 themes we talked about earlier, we can truly be best in class. And if we can make that work and show that we can make something truly extraordinary, often then it becomes infectious to the rest of the organization from there.
I think Jason wanted to come in and then Jeanne.
Great.
Yeah, just for me, I think the power of design, 3 things. One is it can bring tremendous clarity. I think to what Ben was saying, I think a lot of organizations feel like they need to do a lot of things. Almost think like they're a Swiss Army knife, where everything in a Swiss Army knife is good. Arguably the scissors are great. I have that debate with my kids. But I think great organizations that tear truly a page from the book of design thinking and internalize this into their culture, they are very thoughtful about what are the 3 things that we want to be world class in and execute flawlessly. And the rest of it is hygienic. But that's just the start. I think the mistake, secondly, that a lot of organizations make is that they set that on concrete. Those are really hypotheses that you want to test and experiment through different ways. And I think, thirdly is the most important thing, which is an action bias. I think not talking and talking and talking, but doing. And I think many organizations sometimes are surprised by their own success or testing hypotheses. And it is the iterative notion that starts to build confidence as an organization and the capabilities over time that creates a ton of confidence. And whether you call it design thinking or agile enterprise or customer-centered innovation, it becomes a process where the entire culture and the ecosystem of a company becomes aligned around what do we want to do and what does success look like in the sense of how we serve our end customers and not service of ourselves.
Jeanne?
But I worry a little bit that this idea that design works when we can immediately quantify what it brings to the organization is a very undesignerly way to look at the situation. I mean, we need design thinking because of exactly that mentality, because we're afraid to do something that we can't prove within some relatively short amount of time pays off in a very straightforward, easily measured way. And I mean, isn't that the problem that we face? If you want to create a different future, you can't expect the data from the present to necessarily reassure you that you've done the right thing. So I think for organizations, the reason why organizations find it difficult to embrace design, I think, is if we take a traditional management perspective and somehow expect design to behave the way that from a kind of a top-down controlled way we want it to behave, then we'll never achieve the benefits of design. Because in our research, at least, it suggests that the most powerful benefits are very hard to see. They're changes in the way people talk to each other in organizations. They're changes in how inclusive the conversation is and who gets invited in. I think at some point, there's kind of a bright line there. As leaders, we need to make a commitment to a different way of thinking and acting that design offers us. And if we only do that in the places where we can show that 2-year ROI, I don't think it's going to make much of a meaningful difference in the long term.
I think that's a good point to bring in some audience questions. So put your hand up, just your name, organization, and if you have a question, if we have one. Otherwise, yep, right at the back. Is there another question in the room? Because we can gather them at one go. Well,
thanks.
start
So
with one.
nice to hear the panel of reflections. I was connecting something that Tim said earlier of the desire for the posture of designers to be willing to evaluate and reflect constantly. And then contrasting that or putting that up against Ben's statistic of the 95% of executives that feel uncomfortable making objective business decisions based on design, and coming to some middle ground of, if it's not being able to determine what ROI is on design, but is there a middle ground that you've explored or started to see where designers have a meaningful way of assessing the value or the quality of the design they're doing, if it's not in a financial way, but starting to really understand an assessment tool set? How do I know if I'm just starting design, if I'm doing great design?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I mean, I just raised the question, is it a bad thing that 95% of senior executives don't feel like they can objectively decide about design? I mean, would we feel better if they did? I'm not sure we would. It seems to me that's what design is about. That's why it's inherently an experimental methodology, because we can't know in advance. And so even that statistic, I worry, kind of betrays an attitude that is inconsistent with, I think, embracing the kind of value and the mindset that design needs to survive and succeed.
So Ben, how do you use those 4 levers? How do you convince a company and a C-suite that this is the way you need to go? How do you make that happen?
Often, I think they'll recognize themselves that these are areas that they've wanted to work at. Implicitly, I think many leaders have had a sense that these are areas which are strategically important. What I think this does is it brings clarity, it brings structure, it allows them to make decisions. And this is why it's so delicious having these panels, because I'm going to disagree. Look, wild, I'm going to disagree. I think one of the challenges that designers have had up till now is because they haven't been able to speak a language of quantification and in some way integrate with their business counterparts, their voice has been lost, and therefore the ability for design to spread, to infect, to have the benefits that it can bring for an organization have been lessened. If I reflect even on our own hiring ourselves when we look at designers, we're looking for a hybrid designer. 80% absolutely about the craft, the art, and that's very difficult to put a number on. But we are looking for a profile with 20% who has at least an interest in finance, in project management, in the other functions in the business. Because from everything that we've seen, and again, it is a data-led approach, it says that those people who at least have that ability to connect, to integrate, to work with those other people can bring much greater value for the company, but also for the customers at the end of the day, because they're able to bring those products and services to market. 2 other points I'll mention. This research is specifically on the business value of design. And I think Jeanne brings a very good point that there is a broader topic of the value of design. And that touches on other points. That touches on social benefits, environmental benefits, the other powers that this brings. And indeed, the area of design thinking is another topic. Again, that's about internal pieces. This is specifically here about the business value of making great products and services, and statistically, what can you do to best give yourself the chance to get there?
So how do you use the 4 levers to ensure that you're getting the best financial return?
So you would start with an individual product or service and say, aha, isn't it interesting that at the moment the people who are on this team have completely different incentives? That person is incentivized to do just cost, that person just to deliver on time, and that person has been told to make a great product based on customer satisfaction data. You'd start saying, well, that doesn't make sense. How do we bring those people together? How do we join them together so they have the same incentives? How do we give designers enough time to iterate at the beginning? Because often there's so much time pressure that people have to come up with one design, it's locked, before there's really opportunity to improve. How do we involve the leadership in this process? How do we get them, to Jeanne's point, in front of the customers, actually understanding the details of what matters here, because you can't always capture that in a single number? How do we make sure that from a product point of view, we haven't been narrow-sighted and just assume we have to do what we did before? Of course, from client to client, from product to product, the exact challenge changes, but the idea of bringing the themes together statistically gets you to a better place.
I think it's a great question on metrics, and my perspective is you really have to understand the context of what the objective is for whatever stakeholder you're talking about. So for example, CIOs, lots of big budgets on IT. I wouldn't go in talking about design, I would be talking about adoption. and the role that design thinking can drive better adoption. For a CEO, many CEOs are trying to successfully manage change. They have significant business and sometimes technology objectives. People often are an afterthought, although they're critical to the achievement of those objectives. So I think put it in the context of their language, and again, see it as a tool. You could argue, as one example, that we're in the middle of a trust revolution in the world that we live in right now, with what's going on with privacy of data, loss of trust in banking, many, many examples. You know, you watch the news. Take something like trust. I think design thinking has the potential to really bring clarity to an organization around what does trust mean between the individual customer and the brand that you represent. So we look at design, I think like Tim said, as a tool, as an enabler, and the metrics are dependent on what you're trying to achieve. And I think the challenge sometimes with design, especially with large companies, is it can carry a connotation of UX and UI, and it requires sometimes some education to leaders to say, no, great design thinking is actually making sure that it works, whatever it is, and delivers on some outcome that people value. So when you start to think through that lens and the metrics that you're trying to drive, I think that's when you start to get traction. I think that there are also some internal things that you can do around common language and certification, as long as it's not like design theater and hand waving and box checking, and you're really serious about making that investment. I think those things can be very real, so that people feel like they have the psychological safety, the permission to be able to do those sorts of things.
I think as much as I agree about shared language and the like, and how important it is to give your stakeholders what they want, I still have a sense that focusing on the kind of profit and loss equation that design brings is like focusing on the blood pressure effects of Viagra. Right? I think at some level, you know, we all know the story. Viagra was supposed to lower blood pressure, and then it turned out, in an unintended consequence, it did all kinds of things that were more valuable and more unique than all the other blood pressure stuff. And I think design is the same way. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that we meant for design to improve our products and services, but in fact, what it's actually doing is something much more profound. It's not just changing the experience of customers, it's changing the experience of the people who practice it. And again, that's coming more from the design thinking route, because I think it probably already changed designers a while ago. But as you see, for traditionally business-trained people, what taking on these new tools and methods does for them, it transforms, I think, what's possible in organizations. And I would just hate to lose sight of that as we attempt to kind of count the stuff we can count, which is really, to me, the kind of least interesting part of what design will do for us in organizations.
I think that's such a key point to make, right? If you thought that was impressive, you need to catch all three of them in their different breakout sessions where they're going to do a deep dive with you, and you'll have an opportunity to ask them every single question you want to ask them, and also outside. But more than a feeling, we were talking about playing on that word, and I'm glad you stuck with Viagra. She had gone deep diving into many, many facets of Viagra last night when we were talking about how far do we go with this analogy. So please say give my panel a round of applause for keeping it in control. Thank you very much for that, guys.